From your book, Liberty versus the Tyranny of Socialism, you write, "We often hear the claim that our nation is a democracy. That wasn't the vision of the founders. They saw democracy as another form of tyranny. If we've become a democracy, I guarantee you that the founders would be deeply disappointed by our betrayal of their vision."
Yes, I think that's absolutely right. If you read the statements by Madison, Jefferson, and Adams, they condemn the idea of democracy. Matter of fact, you don't find the term democracy in any of our founding documents. That is, you don't find the word democracy in the Declaration of Independence. You don't find the word democracy anywhere in the United States Constitution. And if the listeners want further convincing of this, when we talk about when we pledge allegiance to the flag, is it to the democracy for which it stands, or the republic, or the song during the War of 1861? It was the battle hymn of the democracy or the battle hymn of the republic. Now, the founders thought that the idea of majority rule was a form of tyranny, and if you look at the Constitution, if you read the Constitution represents our rules of the game. It's a very it's an anti-majoritarian document. That is, the president is not elected by a majority vote. The president can veto the wishes of 535 people of Congress, and it takes 2/3 to override his veto. So there are many anti-majoritarian aspects of the United States Constitution, which represents our rules of the game. Any politician who would rigorously live up to his oath of office to uphold and defend the United States Constitution, he just would not get elected to office by the American people, because what politicians reflect, they reflect the values and views of the American people, that is, those who will elect them to office. Now, some people might say, well, gee, Williams, that's a little bit strong. Well, look, we just might ask ourselves, what would happen to a politician who had the vision of, let's say, James Madison, the acknowledged father of the United States Constitution? And in 1794, Congress appropriated $15,000 to help some French refugees. And James Madison stood on the floor of the House irate, and he said, and I'm virtually quoting him, he says, "I cannot undertake to lay my finger on that article in the Constitution that authorizes Congress to spend the money of their constituents for the purposes of benevolence." Now, if you look at the federal budget, 2/3 to 3/4 of it is for the purposes of benevolence. Now, just ask yourself, what would the American people do to a politician, or to anybody running for office, who would make a statement like Madison did, or make another statement? Madison also said that charity is not a legitimate function of government. Now, can you imagine what the American people would do to a politician who said that? And so what I'm saying is that politicians are reflecting the values and views of the people who elect them to office. And unfortunately, the values and views of most Americans are distinct from those of the founders of our nation.
So, Walter Williams, has the Tea Party movement been a positive in your view in American politics?
Well, I think so. It has been it's been a movement, or it's been a group of people who are saying, well, look, let's go back to the Constitution. Let's have constitutional principles. But whether they'll be successful or not is another matter. And keep in mind that, you know, if you look at the founders of our nation, they wanted very, very limited government. If you read in Madison's in Federalist paper, I think it's 45 or 48, and when he was trying to describe to the citizens of New York what was in the Constitution, to kind of get the citizens of New York to ratify the Constitution, he said that the powers that we delegated to the federal government are few and well-defined and restricted mostly to external affairs. Those left with the people and the states are indefinite and numerous. Now, if you turn that upside down, you'd have what we have today. That is, the powers of the federal government are indefinite and numerous, and those of the people in the state are limited and well-defined.
In your book, Liberty versus the Tyranny of Socialism, you quote Tom Paine, "Government, even in its best state, is but a necessary evil in its worst state and intolerable."
That is absolutely right. And I think that we Americans should recognize that the history of mankind has been that of arbitrary abuse and control by others. The founders were not perfect, but they tried to move us away from that. And the main enemy of mankind throughout its history has been government. That is, if you look at the 20th century, it's the most brutal century in the history of mankind. I think that something like 60 million people lost their lives in wartime, but that pales in comparison to the number of people who were murdered by their own government. And the number comes up to somewhere close to 100 million people are murdered by their own government. And matter of fact, these statistics are documented in a book called Death by Government. And so it shows that it's a strong argument that that government is the enemy of mankind. Matter of fact, the framers of our Constitution recognized that. Just look at the language of the Bill of Rights. It says things like, Congress shall not abridge, Congress shall not prohibit, Congress shall not disparage, Congress shall not infringe. Now, if the framers did not think that Congress would do these things, why in the world would they put them in? Why would they put that down in the Constitution? And I've suggested to people that when we die, and if at our next destination we see anything like a Bill of Rights, we know that we're in hell. Because a Bill of Rights in heaven would be an affront to God. It would be saying, well, we can't trust God, you know. And so the framers recognized that the enemy of mankind was government, but they recognized that we do need some government. And as Thomas Paine was pointing out, that the government is under the best of conditions of the necessary evil. And matter of fact, the whole Second Amendment argument about guns, the right to keep and bear arms, most Americans think that the framers gave us the Second Amendment, the right to keep and bear arms, wanted to protect our right to keep and bear arms. They think that it was for deer and duck hunting. But the framers actually come out and say to allow Americans to have some kind of defense against abuse of government. And people like Hamilton said things like to allow the American people to protect themselves against their representatives if they are betrayed by their representatives. And who in the world are their representatives? It's the United States Congress. So I think that the framers held a great distrust for government, that Americans today, I think we love government. That is, the average American loves government, and the reason why the average American loves government is because government can do those things for them that if they did the same thing privately, they would go to jail. That is, government can take my money and give it to you, but if you came up to me with a gun and took my money, you would go to jail. But if you go to Congress and ask them, would you take William's money and give it to me? Oh, well, you know, you don't go to jail, but you have my money. I have a very low tolerance for the TSA people. I think this was a number of years ago, but one time I was traveling and I had carry-on luggage, and in my carry-on luggage I had an eyeglass repair kit. And this TSA person told me I could take the screws, but I could not take the screwdriver. And I said, that's stupid as hell. I said, who ever heard of somebody hijacking an airplane with an eyeglass screwdriver? And so he said, wait here. And so his superintendent came up, and the superintendent asked me, and I repeated myself. He said, it's on the list. Either leave it here or you don't get on the plane. And so I would not have gotten on the plane, but the people that invited me had set up a banquet and things like that, and it would have been pretty awful if I hadn't shown up. But I just shown up. but I just don't travel commercially anymore, and now I just travel on the private plane. If people want to have me to give a talk, and it's a very costly proposition, I just will go by a private plane. I just won't deal with the TSA because I'm too old to go to jail, and I'm not as compliant as most of my fellow Americans. I think people don't really understand much of the history of our country. And just very briefly, and this is on my website and my articles, and I talk about this, and that is in 1783, there was a Treaty of Paris, and the Treaty of Paris ended the war between the colonies in Great Britain. And if you read the Treaty of Paris, it says that there are 13 sovereign nations, that is, each state was a nation, and these states came together as principals in 1787, and they created the federal government as their agent. And principals can always fire their agents. And so, and if you read the ratification documents of Rhode Island, New York, and Virginia, they specifically say in the documents that if the federal government becomes abusive of the powers that we have delegated to the federal government, we have the right to rescind those powers. That is, we have the right to secede. And so most Americans do not understand the they think that the war was solely to end slavery, but the war was for much more than that. And so, but however, the winners of any war write its history. And so the Confederacy has just they've gotten really a bad name, and I think that I think that this anti-Confederacy movement is just maybe one more step towards towards abolishing many of our symbols. Now, one can argue whether the Confederacy was right in seceding, and you don't have to be for slavery. You can be against slavery, but that's an independent argument. Did they have the right to secede? And all the evidence suggests, yes, they did have the right to secede because the states were principals and they came together and created the federal government. That is, most Americans today virtually think that the states are a creation of the federal government. And matter of fact, that's the way Congress acts, that the states are a creation of the federal government, but it's actually the opposite.